This is the brief on the disappearance of 4-year-old Gus Lamont. It's a really chilling case, you know? A little boy just vanishes from this huge rural property in South Australia, no trace, and now it's escalated into a major criminal investigation. Okay, first takeaway. The really strange part? The total lack of evidence. Gus disappeared on September 27th from Oak Park Station. That's this massive place near Java. He was literally meters from his grandmother. So they launched this huge search, right? Covering over 10 square kilometers. You had police, drones, horses, canine units, forensic teams doing grid sweeps, and they found, well, nothing. No footprints, no clothing, no sign of a struggle, not even a scent path for the dogs. Forensic analysts basically said finding absolutely nothing like that is highly uncommon for a kid that age in open terrain. Super weird. Second, because there was zero sign on the ground, the whole thing escalated pretty quickly. After 10 days, the big search was scaled back, and it officially became a criminal inquiry. See, that complete lack of ground signs makes the just wandered off theory kind of tough to square, especially given how massive the search was. So, could someone else be involved? It kind of fits the no trace scenario, but honestly, there's no hard proof either way. Authorities are keeping all options open for now. And finally, think about the impact on the family and the community. The Lamonts have cooperated fully with police. Their stories are consistent. But they face this relentless online nightmare, right? Misinformation, horrible accusations from strangers, even fake AI images. Just awful. This whole thing really underscores how vulnerable things can be in remote rural areas. And, the ongoing silence, it's really damaged trust in the community. Gus Lamont's disappearance remains this persistent mystery, weighing heavily on investigators who are now just focused on methodical forensic work to hopefully bring the family the answers they deserve.
Before we dive into the debate, if you want transparent analysis on the latest issues, hit that subscribe button and to become the part of the community. Now let us continue.
Welcome to the debate. Today we are wrestling with a forensic puzzle of immense emotional and, intellectual complexity. The disappearance of 4-year-old Gus Lamont from a rural property outside Yarra, South Australia, back on September 27th. The fundamental facts are really brutal in their simplicity. A child vanished.
Yeah.
In broad daylight.
Yeah.
Despite what became just a massive coordinated search effort covering well over 10 square kilometers. I mean, we're talking helicopters, thermal drones, highly trained canine units, specialized ground patrols. Absolutely no physical trace of Gus was ever recovered. The ground famously told nothing.
Nothing at all. And that chilling fact, that forensic void, is really where our debate crystallizes today, isn't it?
Exactly. The central question is this. Does the complete absence of recoverable evidence, no footprints, no clothing, and crucially, no sustained scent trail, especially given a search of this magnitude, does that primarily point toward a scenario of accidental wandering, where maybe the evidence was just severely compromised by harsh environmental factors, operational factors?
Or does this highly uncommon forensic anomaly logically force us, really compel us, to give serious and immediate consideration to the possibility of third-party involvement?
And I'll be arguing that accidental wandering remains the most scientifically grounded and, probable theory, though it's profoundly complicated by the specific search context.
Okay, and I'll be arguing that the sheer exceptional nature of this forensic silence fundamentally shifts the probability, away from typical wandering patterns. It necessitates that the initial facts are actually best fit by the hypothesis of, let's say, external displacement or intervention.
Okay, so my position really relies on the structural limitations of the environment itself. Despite the scale, the sophistication of the search, the lack of trace evidence is, I think, best explained by the harsh, erosive environment and, the inherent difficulties of that terrain. This makes accidental wandering the primary operational theory. We aren't talking about soft earth here, are we? We know the property terrain was hard, dry, windswept, often consisting of what locals call calcrete. That's a hardened calcium carbonate layer, pretty typical of the South Australian Outback.
Right, very hard ground.
Exactly. And this substrate, it physically resists the sustained compression a 4-year-old's foot would even need to leave a durable, readable print. Evidence, whether it's scent or physical, it can just be erased in hours by the combination of extreme heat during the day, and that consistent dry wind flow. So we really shouldn't substitute the most common explanation for missing children, which is accidental wandering, with an unproven theory of outside intervention just because the environment prevented us from making a successful forensic recovery.
That's an interesting point about the calcrete, though. I would frame it maybe a bit differently. While the environment is clearly challenging, no one denies that, the forensic analysis of this site determined that the total absence of trace, not just, clear prints, but 0 sustainable canine scent paths and 0 discarded objects, that contradicts typical accidental wandering patterns for a 4-year-old, even in open terrain, even harsh open terrain. My thesis is that the forensic silence is the evidence here.
Okay.
Forensic analysts later describe this finding as highly uncommon. And when they say that, they mean it deviates significantly from the statistical baseline for wandering cases involving children of that age. Usually, you typically yield at least 1 or 2 recoverable items, or maybe a partial scent path within the first few hundred meters, even in challenging conditions. But this massive, methodically logged search, it yielded nothing. That suggests the initial movement, or the trajectory, wasn't typical, short-distance wandering from the homestead. If the child simply walked away, the ground should have told something.
Okay, let's zero in on that phrase, highly uncommon. I understand why that technical finding acts as, an intellectual catalyst, perhaps. But how can we jump from that specific technical assessment to a necessary criminal hypothesis? Doesn't the very nature of this environment, this hard, dry, calcrete-based, wind-swept place, doesn't that provide the context for why evidence would be so incredibly difficult to locate? I mean, when the search experts call it highly uncommon, are they fully factoring in the hyper-specific, highly destructive atmospheric conditions of that particular South Australian outback location? Or are they perhaps comparing it to standard search patterns in, say, more temperate, more humid environments where scent lingers longer, where ground holds prints better?
Well, I come at it from a different way, I suppose. That technical finding, for me, it forces us to examine the limitations of search science in this precise context. You're right, the search wasn't merely relying on footprints, it included sophisticated resources like canine units. So, if you are going to blame the environment, you really have to dissect the failure of the canine units.
Okay, fair point.
The high heat and wind certainly increase what's called vapor pressure deficit, right? Which causes those volatile organic compounds, the source of scent, to evaporate almost instantly. That's exactly why canine tracking is notoriously difficult in low humidity, high heat environments. We know that. However, the data we have suggested the dogs did pick up a scent near the homestead, but it faded almost immediately into, nothingness. Now, if the child was simply wandering off, we would expect a gradual degradation, albeit perhaps weak, but a gradual degradation of the scent path over distance, not an immediate sharp interruption of the ground path like that. So, yes, the lack of trace is difficult to reconcile with the scale and methodology of the search. Therefore, I think we must consider the scenario that removes the child from the ground path immediately.
That's a compelling point, I grant you, focusing on the technical limitations of scent detection. But that line of reasoning, it sort of begins to substitute a lack of positive forensic input for positive evidence of a crime, doesn't it? And that brings us exactly to the problem with relying too heavily on the third-party hypothesis at this stage. If external displacement occurred, why did the extensive criminal background checks, including the forensic sweep of the family's environment, the telecommunication data review, the highway surveillance footage review along the barrier highway, why did all that yield none of the necessary cross-check data?
Right.
We have no unusual phone activity reported, no verified vehicle traces, no verified sightings of a person or vehicle near the property at the relevant time. The evidence isn't just missing for Gus, it seems to be missing for the hypothetical perpetrator as well.
I see why you think that, but that expectation of corroborating evidence, a phone ping or highway camera footage, I think that's based on an assumption of high visibility, which is just false in this location. The barrier highway is vast, and this property is in a very low-trace rural environment. There are almost no security cameras, minimal crowds. The property itself is isolated. A perpetrator, theoretically, needs only a very small window of time and minimal visibility for displacement. We can't reasonably expect high-definition, cross-checked evidence from highway surveillance in such a scenario.
So the vastness is the issue?
The vastness works against the searchers and the investigators. Yes. Moreover, the premise of my argument is that the child was removed almost immediately. This explains why they wouldn't have left a scent path or prints further out into the scrub. The failure of the search to find trace immediately around the homestead is precisely what makes the external displacement theory viable, in my view. And the failure of external surveillance to capture a trace, well, that just reflects the operational reality of this specific location, not necessarily a refutation of the hypothesis itself.
I'm still not entirely convinced by that line of reasoning because it sounds a little like we are creating a theory, the outside intervention hypothesis, which is definitionally immune to refutation by lack of evidence. When the canine unit's trace sense that began near the homestead but faded into nothing, look, this is equally compatible with the child making a very short dash, perhaps into a gully or a specific patch of dense scrub, where the initial large-scale human contamination from the search effort itself quickly destroyed any subtle scent trail. We have to always consider the operational reality. That property instantly became a command post, crawling with people.
That's a valid point about search contamination. Absolutely. The search did become highly disruptive within the first few hours. However, this is where the sheer scope of the search pushes back against the simple wandering hypothesis for me. The methods used, thermal cameras, high-resolution drones, teams walking literally shoulder to shoulder, these were specifically designed to overcome challenges posed by terrain and, yes, even mild contamination. If a child merely hid in a gully or scrub, the thermal imaging should have located them, especially during those critical first hours before the environmental factors really took their full toll. If Gus moved, even a short distance, the thousands of hours logged by the search teams, they should have visually located a 4-year-old child in that scrub, even if prints were missed. The canine scent fading out like that suggests, to me at least, that Gus's direction of travel was immediately interrupted, or perhaps that he was lifted off the ground path entirely. The environmental factors alone just seem insufficient to explain the complete null result.
That's an interesting analysis, arguing that the search methodology was perhaps too robust to fail unless the child was removed. But let's step back for a second and consider the profile of a missing 4-year-old. Young children, they can be masters of subtle concealment. They don't think logically like adults. They react to distress or fatigue by hiding, often in places searches have already passed or maybe even deemed impossible for entry. The sheer density of the scrub out there, combined with the known structural limitations of large-scale search science, where search grid errors, even minor ones, are a recognized possibility, it means we just cannot discount the possibility that Gus is very close to the property, concealed by natural means, and his prints or scent were destroyed by the initial rush of the search effort. We must maintain accidental wandering as the default operational theory until we get a single piece of evidence, direct or circumstantial, that suggests otherwise. We might be focusing too much on the environmental failure when we should perhaps be focusing more on the profile of the missing individual.
But the profile of the individual is precisely why the forensic silence is so telling. We are talking about a 4-year-old. They generally don't possess the cognitive ability or the physical stamina to actively hide for days without moving or leaving some kind of trace, especially under the thermal stress of that environment. The highly uncommon nature of the silence, that's the key data point that the Major Crime and Missing Persons Unit is operating on. The criminal investigation, which is running concurrently with the ongoing missing persons inquiry, it exists specifically because experts couldn't reconcile the complete lack of ground sign with a typical wandering scenario, even when accounting for environmental degradation. The investigation itself is built on that anomaly, and the anomaly arguably points away from simple walking away.
Okay, I accept that the silence is profoundly unsettling. It creates enormous challenges for search science, and yes, it challenges the typical operational assumptions used in these types of missing person cases. However, the specific, brutal conditions of the hard, dry South Australian outback,
They provide a credible, non-criminal explanation for the failure to recover physical trace evidence. So, to pivot the primary hypothesis to one of malice, purely based on a lack of retrieval, when zero corroborating evidence for that malice exists, no suspicious vehicles, no telecom anomalies, nothing concrete, that feels like following convenience, perhaps, not forensic integrity. Therefore, accidental wandering complicated by severe environmental and operational factors, it just has to remain the default assumption until malice or evidence of it surfaces.
And I maintain that the exceptional, highly uncommon nature of the forensic silence, confirmed by expert analysis, elevates the absence of evidence to the primary piece of data in this specific case. This forensic anomaly logically directs investigators to seriously consider possibilities that circumvent typical movement patterns, such as third-party involvement. Even while, yes, professional skepticism regarding the lack of direct criminal evidence is absolutely maintained, the integrity of the investigation demands that we try to explain the void, and the external displacement hypothesis seems to fit that forensic void most neatly, or at least as neatly as any other theory right now.
Well, I think we both agree on the complexity of this situation. This is that really difficult middle ground where hope and law meet. Investigators have to base their work on forensic integrity, while acknowledging that, to date, no conclusive evidence has surfaced, either confirming a simple wandering path or detailing a crime.
Absolutely. And the necessity of keeping all scenarios, accidental wandering, search error, and third-party intervention, fully open and subject to continuous review. That reflects the careful, methodical criminal investigation that continues today. The silence is the key, isn't it? And it requires this rigorous, dual-pronged approach to possibility until something breaks.